In a letter from the Rebbe 73 years ago, dated Zayin Menachem of Tafshin Yud Beis, so not exactly today's date, but 3 days ago, 2 days before Tisha B'Av, addressed to Harav HaGoyd, Harav HaChassid, etc., Merenu Harav Rebbe Ephraim Eliezer Shichya HaKayan, which, as they point out on the bottom, is referring to the Rav Ephraim Eliezer Yolles, who was a Rav in Philadelphia, and we'll get a bit more to him and his connection with the Rebbe in a bit. But the Rebbe writes to him, Shalom Ubracha Be'ita Kibalti Mechtovei Marish Chodesh Menachem Av. Received your letter from 7 days before that. This is printed with the letters in this date in Tafshin Yud Beis, Igros Kodesh Chilik Vav, Kayetz Tafshin Yud Beis, letter number 1762. The Rebbe writes, I received your letter. Shaboy Koisev al Devar ha-yahrzeit shel Yud l'chodesh Menachem, in which you write about the yahrzeit of Yud of the month of Menachem. As we know, the month of Av, the real, official, historical name is just Av, and there's this minhag to refer to it as Menachem Av, which is very common. Today it's sort of interchangeable. You could say Chodesh Av, Chodesh Menachem Av. The Rebbe, it would seem, is pretty makbid to consistently call it Chodesh Menachem Av. The Rebbe spoke about the significance of the name Menachem and Menachem Av a number of times. But we also find that some just referred to the month as Menachem for short, and I think the Rebbe addressed that as well. It's not the topic and the focus here, but it's interesting how the Rebbe writes, Shaboy Koisev al Dvar ha-yahrzeit shel Yud l'chodesh Menachem. Maybe that's how Rav Yolles wrote it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is mirroring his language back to him. At any rate, the Rebbe is acknowledging a letter about the yahrzeit of Yud l'chodesh Menachem. That's today's date, and the Rebbe does not spell out what yahrzeit, whose yahrzeit, and he continues, and I want to get to what what the Rebbe continues with shortly as well. But I wanted to shtelzech first and foremost on the premise of this letter. What's the yahrzeit of Yud l'chodesh Menachem? I don't know if it's the right terminology to use, but you could say that the Rebbe is praving, at least b'shem HaMoshel, the Rebbe is praving a yahrzeit of Yud l'chodesh Menachem, Yud Menachem Av. What yahrzeit? Whose yahrzeit? It's not here on the footnote. They're not Tzayin, they're not Mefarish, whose yahrzeit. Looked around, they didn't see that this letter was quoted anywhere, that anyone explained what this letter is referring to. So we'll take the opportunity to elaborate on the yahrzeit of Yud l'chodesh Menachem, and then we'll go on, we'll take a look at what the Rebbe writes Behemshech, which seems very interesting once you understand the context in light of what the Rebbe is writing this letter and what the yahrzeit of Yud Menachem of Yud l'chodesh Menachem is. So as it happens, yesterday I was searching through the newspapers of 100 years ago on this date, as I am wont to do. So I was going by the Goyish date, August 3rd. And I came across an item from one of the Israeli newspapers. I don't have the tziyun, the name of the paper in front of me. I think it was Kol Yisrael, and the date would be August 3rd. And they write, Hashavua be'eretz Yisrael, HaGoyin HaTzadik, Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles Zatzal. So they're notifying of the passing of Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles. And they write, but Tisha B'Av Be'erev, on Tisha B'Av in the evening, at the end of the day, Nifter Be'ir HaKodesh Yushalayim, Achrei Machla Memushacha, HaGoyin HaMefursam, Marino Arav Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles Atzal, Av, based in the Kehilas Stryi. The Chaver Mayetzes Gedolei HaTorah. So that's who passed away, Taka Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles of Stryi, who was a Chaver Mayetzes Gedolei HaTorah, presumably referring to, I would think, Aguda of Poland. I didn't dig too deeply into that detail. The departed, the Nifter, the Manoach, Mameshos Min Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael right before Shavuos, and now Tammuz of 2 months later fell ill and he passed away. So the Rabbanim of Yerushalayim Taka announced the Levaya, and the race of Chaim Zonenfeld Shlita was Maspid, the Nifter, the Manoach, Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles. So immediately I see the name Yolles, and clicked for me. There's a connection to the famous Rav B'Ephraim Eliezer Yolles had a connection to the Rebbe. So I went and I looked. Taka, sure enough, this is Taka, the father of Rebbe Ephraim Eliezer Yolles. I'm not going to say Hakoyin each time. It goes without saying that they're Kehanim. They go by the title Hakoyin, and we're making a Moidar Rabba that the Mishpacha are known as Shalom Hakoyin and B'Ephraim Eliezer Hakoyin. Knowing that he passed away in Yerushalayim and was buried in Yerushalayim, I went looking for his matzeva, and there are different databases where one might find matzevas, especially of Eretz Yisrael. I found it on billiongraves.com, and a big chashva matzeva. Not going to say all the lashonos, but says Nitman Adam Gadol Ba'anokim Ish Tzadik Tamim Yechusi Kuhuna Hey Chassid Hey Anov Sar HaTorah Goin HaHayra Yiras Hashem Eitzarei HaGoin HaTzadik HaMefursam Kved Kedusha Hashem Tefartei Moron Shalom HaKoyin Yolles Admor Ve'av Beis the Kehilas Stryi Zecher Tzadik HaKosh Labrach etc. Ben Hi Saba Kadisha Tzadik Yisrael Oilam Eves Hador Atmar Kadosh VaTor etc. Moron Uri Kahana Rabbe Kadisha Misambor Uli Imo Yatzitkanis etc. Yashav Al Kisei HaYira Vidin Lamayla Me'arboim Shana was based in 3 Kehillas Ir Chadash Mashtsisk Ustri Vehemet Tabidim Harbe here but Torah Yishmaim Kedusha Betara B'Shnas HaShivim L'Chayav when he was 70 Allah Eretz HaKodesh V'Olson Nishmas Betara Early Yoim Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parshas V'Eschanon Yud Menachem of Tafresh Pehei Be'ir HaKodesh Yerushalayim etc. And they also wrote the Maskeres Netzach of Zugasoi. I guess you'd have to check the dates. It says that Niftere in Tafresh Pei Be'ir Stri. So she'd been buried there, left her behind, and she had a matzeva there, but they added a Maskeres Netzach on this matzeva as well. I don't know if this entire matzeva is from when he passed away, or maybe they upgraded it later and they added the Maskeres Netzach later. Don't know for sure. But I went through all the lashonos and descriptions because it summarizes his life, his biography, and his maimids, and how he was seen by his family and by those who knew him, with these lashonos, with these tayarim. And we see that the date written on the matzeva, even though the newspapers made it sound like it was Tisha B'Av in the evening, it sounds like it's still the date of Tisha B'Av, but on the matzeva state, early Yom Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parshas V'Eschanon, Yud Menachem of Tafresh Pehei. So it's very clear, first of all, that we're marking 100 years since his passing. So I think it's worthy, especially since it's a gadol who's not as well known, as famous. Others aren't marking it, and I have a koch and a geschmack to mark events that are 100 years old, especially those that haven't been mentioned elsewhere that I come across in my searches. So that's one reason. And secondly, it's pretty clear that the pshat in the letter of the Rebbe to B'Ephraim Eliezer from Tov Shin Yud Beis, pretty obvious to me that the Rebbe is acknowledging a letter from B'Ephraim Eliezer concerning the fact that the yahrzeit of his father, Shalom HaKoyin, coming up, Yud L'Chodesh Menachem. So that's the yahrzeit that Rebbe is referring to and acknowledging. So for that reason as well, it's a yahrzeit that the Rebbe acknowledged. Like I said, I don't think pravit is the right word, but B'Shem HaMoshel, it's a yahrzeit that Rebbe acknowledged, and as we'll see, the hemshech of the letter seems to be following up on that. The Rebbe shares a thought that seems to be connected somehow to the yahrzeit of Yud L'Chodesh Menachem. So between the Mea Shana, the 100 years, and this interesting letter of the Rebbe that probably hasn't been understood and hasn't been analyzed before, thought it would be a nice premise to focus on. So we'll focus a bit on the letter, a bit on Makairis relating to that, and then we'll focus a bit on Reb Shalom HaKoyin Yolles of Stryi more generally, where he fits in, and some tshuvas perhaps that survived of his writings, and then more generally on the connection between the Rebbe and Rebbe Yolles of Philadelphia, and perhaps what we can understand about that connection, about that relationship, and whether having a better understanding of his background, of his context, and in this case who his father was and who his family were, whether that could shed and provide some insight on the Rebbe's connection taka with Rav Yolles, which I think has also been not fully understood, not fully appreciated, and not fully analyzed. So we have many directions we can go in, but I guess let's go back to the letter, and then we'll get to the rest. So in the letter, the Rebbe says, you write in your letter that maybe this is taka the chiluk between Shaul and Dovid. That Shaul did not have a connection with all the types in his generation. And the Rebbe goes on the Rebbe seems to be attributing this point to Yolles Jr. And the Rebbe takes that idea and runs with it, as we'll see shortly. But it's like sort of unclear. So what's the hemshech? What's the segue? There's a yahrzeit which wasn't spelled out, but we identified what it is. So I'm not 100% certain, not 100% confident, but I think b'derech afsher. And this ties into the larger point I want to make, that the Rebbe had a very deep connection with Rebbe Ephraim Eliezer, Yolles, and I think a big part of that was that the Rebbe appreciated his background and his yichus, and something I want to spell out a bit and explicate and put in context. But Ephraim Eliezer, his father, Shalom HaKoyen, as we saw on the Matzeva, they write Aloshin Admor. So we saw in the notice of his passing, they didn't write Ha'admor, they wrote Agoyin HaMefursum, Agoyin HaTzadik. But on the Matzeva they write Admor, and as we'll get to, it's a bit ambiguous. Some of the members of this family were sort of on the borderline between Rav and Admor. We covered the topic a bunch of recordings ago about the Shaila Bechlal, of the nature and the definition of what a Rebbe is and which framework Rebbes fit into, and the idea that some Rebbes fit or were building on a Rav framework. And we do find, as the history of Chassidus continued, maybe particularly in Poland, in places like that, that you have Azelcha Benon Shal Kedoshim, people with yichos who are serving mainly as a Rav, but they also have the Rebbe title, the Rebbe hat, at least a little bit, and you have it today as well, I think, in the Chassidish world. And it's an interesting phenomenon to examine, to consider. But I would imagine that Ephraim Eliezer did view his father as something of a Rebbe, and that's the Matzeva. Certainly, the way the Matzeva was written reflects that. I'm imagining he would have had a hand in the Nusach HaMatzeva, so that perhaps reflects how he viewed his father. I'm going to get shortly. I have Hakdama to his sefer that he printed himself, Ephraim Eliezer. He has a Hakdama where he describes the yichus, the background of his grandfather, his father, and we could take a look at that as well. But I think he must have viewed his father as an Admor, as something nishtama arav. So it would seem that when the Rebbe says Mashamask b'mechtavish zehu, seemingly the yard, something to do with the yahrzeit, this is only the chiluk between Shaul and Dovid. And the Rebbe goes on in this vein. It would seem to me that this thought about Shaul and Dovid had something to do with the yahrzeit, something to do with the person whose yahrzeit it is. So we can only speculate, and if anyone has a better pshat, whether it builds on what I'm saying or disagrees with what I'm saying, maybe I overlooked something, but it would seem to me that Rabbi Yolles was trying to come up with a framework to explain and compare his father and Rebbes from his family, Rebbes of that nature, with other Rebbes, perhaps even with the Rebbes of Chabad. And it sounds like perhaps Rabbi Yolles was suggesting that his father, the Bala Yahrzeit, is more b'fchinas Shaul versus other Rebbes, perhaps like Chabad Rebbes, that are b'fchinas Dovid. And Rabbi Yolles himself seemed to acknowledge that Shaul wasn't fully connected with all the types. That maybe Admoire Chabad, if my assumption is correct, Admoire Chabad seemed to have a connection with Gans Klal Yisrael. You see that with the Rebbeim very clearly, obviously. Whereas other Rebbes, Lav Dafka, and he's trying to give a spiritual framework to say that there's a Shaul framework and a Dovid framework, and Shaul is not the type to be connected to everyone, and maybe that's connected to the Bala Yahrzeit. That is my assumption. That is my Havana. So the Rebbe takes this point and says, what you're saying is, Bevuru, b'Maimer Razal, is a Maimer Razal that says, Shaul had a malchus, and Dovid had a malchus, but Shaul's malchus didn't have a kiyum. Why not? So the Gemara says, where was it signed to Yuma, the Chavez Beis. Gemara, I didn't look it up. We're going to go based on how the Rebbe quotes it. That the problem with Shaul Dafka was the problem was he was too perfect. He had no problems. Or maybe that's the Gemara in Yuma. I would have to look it up to be sure. But it's a very interesting lashon of Chazal that when you appoint a parnas alat tzibur, and recently we did a recording, we spoke about the whole geder of a rav, whether there is a geder of a rav in halacha or not, and whether the status of a rav is actually building on a larger framework, a larger, older framework of a parnas alat tzibur, a leader, and the leader doesn't necessarily have to be leading through Torah per se, but many rabbanim do lead through Torah, but many rabbanim are talking not really a parnas, and they're just more honorary, or they just are answering shalos and halacha, so they're more of a moed hira, and not really a maradasa, and how these terms are very unclear and blur into each other. At any rate, the Gemara here not referring to a rav, which wasn't exactly a thing, but a parnas. Parnas alat tzibur. It's an expression, but the implication of the expression is that there is dirt on him. There is something wrong. There is something flawed with the parnas, and that's a good parnas to appoint for the tzibur. We're not delving here directly into the Maimer Chazal b'Mekoirei and what the Pashta Pshat or what the different Pirushim, different Rishonim Achronim is, but we're going with the general gist. And as I just implied, the terms could be blurry, so parnas could be borrowed here to refer to whichever status that Rebbe and his correspondent are referring to. It's all interchangeable to some extent. Malchus, parnas, rav, Rebbe. So Shaul, it was too perfect, and a parnas needs to have a kupa shel shiratzim. Now, the Rebbe goes on to say that we have to be medayik in the lashon. The lashon is that the kupa shel shiratzim is me'achayrav. We don't want the parnas to lean too much into the kupa shel shiratzim. There have to be some flaws, but they have to be me'achayrav. And on the bottom, there's a ha'ara la'achre zeh, or la'achre zman, probably is the Rosh Tevis. The Rebbe, we find ha'ara la'achre zman, and the Rebbe wrote lahar bitanya perik beis v'apoishim achirayim, the musik of achirayim there. At any rate, even though it has to be me'achayrav, but b'chol eifin sorech liyas hadavar. There has to be, in order to be a leader, you have to have a kupa shel shiratzim. And it's not just b'cholalis, the Rebbe says, that it's a flaw b'cholalis, no, but pratius, that as we'll see, the manik has to have a shaykhis to all the flaws, b'fratius. The kayedua hasipur shel admarim, sorry, the Rebbe refers here to the story of Mittel Rebbe, and the Rebbe quotes it, paraphrases, without saying the story, that you can't answer Shaila in Yechidus about Tikkunim until you find a flaw in yourself, bedakos to dakos. And the bottom of the Metzayin to letter of the Fidig Rebbe. And it's the story the Fidig Rebbe describes by Arichus, how the Mittel Rebbe came somewhere on a Nasiya, and they were doing Yechidus, and suddenly the Mittel Rebbe stopped. And it seemed like it was a terrible matziv, Oyim Benoira, and tremendous Arichus, but the punchline is that someone came in with a horrible Aveda that he needed, he required a tikkun for, and Mittel Rebbe couldn't find the bedakos, and that was taken to be a bad thing. So does that mean that Mittel Rebbe has it and he can't find it, or what does it mean? Until Mittel Rebbe found it in himself, and on one occasion the Rebbe revealed what the Aveda was, an Aveda that even today would be considered pretty horrific, but the specific Aveda is described. We're not going to mention it here. And also how the Mittel Rebbe found it in himself, bedakos to dakos, nothing remotely comparable in straightforward begashmios, but the Mittel Rebbe found out that Mittel Rebbe was able to find the connection and find the bedakos. So we find this story of the Mittel Rebbe. So that means that a parnas, and clearly in this context, by invoking Mittel Rebbe, it's very clear that we're talking about Rebbes and Manhigim, that when it says the Gemara, parnas needs to have a kupa shel shiratzim, this corresponds to this idea in Teres Chabad that the Rebbe needs to find, if he's giving a tikkun, he needs to find the inyan in himself, bedakos to dakos, and it's a theme that comes up in a number of places in Teres Chabad. And the Rebbe is confirming that this is the taka, the idea. This is the nekuda, and this ties into this Shaul and Dovid. So Shaul's problem was that he didn't have this trait, he didn't have the kubashal shiratzim, he didn't have the doifi. And that meant that the Malchus couldn't have a kiyum. It was too up there, too lofty. And Afka, the Malchus of Dovid, and Dovid is taka described, if we can say, Dovid is described in the Chazal as being, or really in Tanakh itself as well, as having various flaws, whatever they represent and mean. And Dafka that has a kiyum. And the Rebbe is tying this back to the Lashon that he quoted from the letter that was written to him, that Shaul did not have a connection with all types, and the Rebbe is teaching it and connecting it to this idea that Shaul was too removed, too lofty, he couldn't find a connection with everybody. And a real manig, a real leader, a real parnas needs to find a connection, and finding a connection necessarily requires having some doifi, having a kupishal shratzim, chayrov, but it's there, and that's al derech mit Rebbe, finding the problem b'dakas to dakas. The Rebbe goes on and says, b'seichel ha'pashat, and that's, maybe we're speaking a little bit lofty in the loft, but b'seichel ha'pashat, you want to teach it, guard pashat, you can connect it to the Drash of Chazal, Pasuk in Shmois, Chav Gimel, Chaval, Parsha Mishpatim, talks about Hashem will send a malach, and there's like this interesting lashon there. I had to go look it up to confirm it. That's taka the lashon. It's like an interesting lashon. You don't necessarily remember it, but it says Al Tamer Boy Kilo Yisol Afishachem. That's the lashon there in Mishpatim. Don't start up because he won't tolerate your sins. So Chazal say we're on the Rashi there that it's like you're dealing with a malach. A malach is kihu menakas she'ein chayten. He's from the sect, the group that don't sin. So the malach doesn't sin, so he can't tolerate sin. And that's seichel ha'pashat. That's the Shaul, and that's nicht al pi pashat, but the malach from Parsha Mishpatim, that's al pi pashat. At any rate, what's al pi pashat? We have stories of other tzadikim as well. Stories about the Michal Zlotchever and other stories that are on this theme, that there are certain tzadikim, the Lav Dafka knew how to relate to the everyman's problems, to their Averas, and part of it meant that if the Avera came to their attention, they couldn't tolerate it, and so it really wasn't necessarily for them, their Aveda, to deal with it. This comes up in different places as well. So when the story about the Rebbe is told, it's not necessarily conveyed and portrayed that way. It just sounds like an al-pi-ruchnis, you have to find the connection yourself. But it's connecting to al-pi pashat. Al-pi pashat is that the person who can't relate to your struggles won't be tolerant, won't be understanding, won't be patient. So that's which is more explicitly derived from this pasuk with the malach. That's b'seichel ha'pashat, and from there we can extrapolate to other applications as well. That if a tzaddik is generally someone who does relate to Avedas, but he can't relate to a certain Aveda, so then that's going to be a problem. And if he can't relate to the Aveda, it's mashma that he has no shaychus to the Aveda. And if he can relate to the Aveda, it means that he does have some kind of shaychus to the Aveda. And that's why he's looking for the Aveda in himself, but dakas to dakas. So the tzaddik can say, if I could be nichshol in this, but dakas to dakas, so I guess I can understand how this person could be nichshel in the same thing, boif and gas, b'yoser. So these are all expressing the same point and the same idea. And that's how the Rebbe takes this line that Yolles apparently wrote, and the Rebbe extrapolates and spells it out. So, like I said, lafi my kav, my malach, my havana, it sounds like the Rebbe is saying that could be the word tzadikim, perhaps tzadikim, such as your father, the Bala Yahrzeit of Yud Menachemov, tzadikim, that they had the title of Rebbe, they had the title of Admor. Maybe Taka we see that he wasn't Meforsim als an Admor that people flock to. And then you have Admoidim that people flock to. Mashma, that some tzadikim have more of a shaykhis to people, and some tzadikim have less of a shaykhis to people. So Kemen Zagen that tzadikim that have less of a shaykhis to people, they're b'fchinas Shaul. And tzadikim that have a shaykhis to people are b'fchinas Dovid, and that's the chiluk between Shaul and Dovid. So it's als stimmt, it all fits, it all ties together, and that seems to be the point that Rebbe is saying, that clearly at Moed Chabad, the Rebbe mentions the Rebbe explicitly, at Moed Chabad subscribe to the Dovid model of leadership, but that taka means whatever that means in the context of the Rebbe, that there is a certain shaykhus to these inyanim bedakas to dakas, whereas other tzadikim can't find that shaychus, and the Rebbe seems to be, some would say very generously, or whatever term you want to use, but the Rebbe seems to be acknowledging and accepting that this is a fitting framework to understand some Rebbes versus other Rebbes, and presumably some Rebbes like his father, the Baalei Yahrzeit. The Rebbe adds, and it says here Shmuel Aleph Kapitel Yutes. I'm not sure if there's a mistake here. I looked it up quickly, and it seemed like it's in Sefer Likutim La'arizal Shoiftim Kapitel Yutes, and in Likuti Torah La'arizal I think Shmuel Aleph. So there are different collections, different compilations of the Arizal's Torah. At any rate, there's the Lashon Inyan Shal Dovid that the Rebbe writes. Inyan Gamken Inyan Shal Dovid. Talk of the Lashon there. Lahavin Inyan or Inyan Shal Dovid, and it says that there it says like emphasizes Dafka like the Tzidkus, that Dovid's Tzidkus is described a lot more in the Torah, in the Nach and the Nevi'im, and Shaul is described less. And what's the pshat? And it says there that Shaul is talking from Alma Diskasya and Dovid is from Alma Disgalia. And the Rebbe Mitzayin to it seems to be implying that this also can be fit. You can fit this into this framework, into this template, that it can all shtim and go together. That someone who's from Alma Diskasya is just more removed in various ways, and someone who is Alma Disgalia is revealed and connected in various ways. That is the thought that Rebbe shared with Yolles. And the Rebbe says, also included a hisafa l'reshimas eicha that was printed recently. That's the reshimas of the Tzemach Tzedek on eicha that are now part of the set of the HaTorah. So they had printed the reshimas of eicha, and they printed a hisafa that was printed more recently. And I'm sending it, I'm including it. And surely you'll receive it before the yahrzeit. Interestingly, the Rebbe is responding 7 days after Yolles' letter was sent, but the Rebbe seems to assume that his response will reach the destination within 3 days before the yahrzeit. And so the Rebbe once again is acknowledging the yahrzeit. I don't know if there's any particular connection between the Hisafa l'Reshimas Eicha to the yahrzeit or to the previous point, or Bechlal, that here's my shtatfus in the yahrzeit, here's what we just printed. The Rebbe would often, when writing to anyone about anything, would say, and here's the most recent thing we printed, and you should be able to connect it to whatever is going on, whatever the next important date is. The Rebbe concluded, so this is the letter of the Rebbe to Rav Yolles, which, as I believe I've revealed, is focusing on the yahrzeit of Yud Menachem of his father Shalom HaKohen Yolles. As Meretchain of letters from the Rebbe to Rav Yolles from this time of year, so I noticed there's a chabura in Chabad, there's a WhatsApp group that has a project of going through the Rebbe's letters from 70 years ago. So right now they're going through the letters of Tafshin Tezvav, and particularly week by week, every week they post the letters that the Rebbe wrote during that week in Tafshin Tezvav. And I saw they posted the letter stocker for this week, and there's a letter. This is letter number 3707, and it's Yud Beis Menachem of Tafshin Tezvav, and it's also to Befram Eliezer HaKohen. It's a shorter letter. It says, I received your letter from Tzemach Hamishi, which is the Tzayim of Tisha B'Av. And it says, I was happy that you chazed the Maimer Tzima Mishpati Pada Shabalikuti Torah. Talk the Rebbe of Nifkeshu Machshaveseinu Yachad. And wow, our thoughts were mamish on the same page. We connected virtually, remotely. How did our thoughts connect? Even Shabbos Shabbos Atzmoi Ela Shabbat Saharayim Asisi Kanak. It's the same Shabbos, but in the afternoon, I also chazed the Maimer Tzima Mishpati Pada Likuti Torah. And we also printed the Maimer with regards to the Tzemach Tzedek, and it's included here. And Yiratzin, Mekuyim, Bekarev, Tzim, Mishpati Padash, Rabbi Tzak, Baruchnias, Shazeh Atzmai, Hu Achana, Bekli, Lakim, Kipshutter, the Matbas Haratfachim, short letter, but very interesting. Lashon, Nifke Shemach Shavesinu Yachad, and this gets a little bit at the connection between the Rebbe and Rav Yolles. And when I came across this letter, having looked a little bit, having run into Rav Yolles' name and the news of the passing, when I saw this letter, maybe go search if there are other letters from the Rebbe to him around this time and that acknowledge the yahrzeit. And that's how I found the other letter, Tafshi Yud Beis, that acknowledges the yahrzeit. Here the Rebbe doesn't refer to it explicitly. I would imagine that Rav Yolles writing to the Rebbe in Tisha B'Av probably would have mentioned something with regard to the yahrzeit there as well, but here the Rebbe didn't focus on that, mention that. But seeing this letter, Taka inspired me to find the other letter, which clearly does seem to be referring to the yahrzeit that I happened to run into, to come across. And like I said, this letter by the Rebbe expressing nifkeshu machshvesinu yachad, very special, unusual lashon, which gets at the connection that Rebbe had with Yolles, also sort of spurred me and inspired me to consider this as a serious topic worth discussing, because this tells us about the importance that Rav Yolles held for the Rebbe and sheds light on the previous letter as well. Before I continue, get back to Rav Yolles, I wanted to point out that we actually find that the beard in this letter, and the Rebbe's discussion about Shaul and Dovid, and the Kupa Shel Shratzim and Mitla Rebbe, we actually find that the Rebbe repeated this teichen in a sicha a bunch of years later, Shabbos Parsha Shmini, Mevorchem HaChodesh, Erev Rosh Chodesh Iyar, Tavshin Chav Dalet. I didn't see, it doesn't seem to be printed in Sichas Kodesh. Maybe the Rishima was only Nizgala in the last few decades, but it is in Teres Menachem, Chelik Lamed Tes, page 376 onward. And there the Rebbe was Mevorchem HaChodesh, Erev Rosh Chodesh Iyar, so the Rebbe stellt sich on the Haftarah of Machar Chodesh, and the Rebbe asked some questions relating to that, and the Rebbe said, V'yuvin behektem, what's Taka, the story, what's Pshat with Shaul himself, the father of Yonasan. The Haftarah focuses on Dovid Yonasan, but Shaul is also a pretty major character in that Haftarah. So Bechlal, to understand Shaul versus Dovid, so the Rebbe says, Shteit in Gemara, Taka the same Gemara Yuma, that says, Ben Shana, Shaul ben Mochai. Shaul was 1 year old and he ruled. It doesn't make sense. So the Gemara could Ben Shana. He was equivalent to 1 year old, Shleit Tam Tam Chet. He never sinned. So, sounds good. No, that was talking the problem. There was no doifi. So in the context there, though, the way Rashi teaches doifi there, like I say, if you look it up in the context, the way Rashi teaches doifi is specifically doifi mishpacha. There was nothing wrong with his family, whereas Dovid had the issue that he was a descendant of Rosh Hamayaviyah. And the Gemara Taka says, and again, Rashi there seems to say, Taich is Doifi Mishpacha. So that whole Gemara, the few Rashi there, is through the prism of Doifi Mishpacha. And that way, you have something, you can hold it against them, that if the Parnas gets too carried away with themselves, you can tell them, hey, Chazar Lacharecha, hey, remember where you come from, you have a Kupashal Shratz. And that's sort of the context in the Gemara. But as we saw, it's possible to, it's not, the doifi mishpacha isn't spelled out in the Gemara, and it's possible to interpret it more widely. And we'll see here how the Rebbe, while quoting the doifi mishpacha, seemingly teaches it into the same idea, into the same framework. The Rebbe says, L'chayra, how can you say about Dovid that Tazuach Daitib is going to feel too good about himself? You're going to tell him you have doifi mishpacha? Number one, why should he be insulted? The Merus Hamayaviyah also, he came from Rus. How is that a doifi in him? In other words, if you take the Gemara out of context, doifi sounds like a personal flaw, as we seem to assume before. But in the context, it's doifi mishpacha. But what's the insult? You're telling him that your baba was so and so. So what? And number two is doch an isser to tell about shuva or a ger schar masachar yishanim. You can't Rus herself. You couldn't tell her. Remember where you came from. Punkt, this topic Grado just came up online somewhere this week. We're not going to klal. But it's always good to remember this halacha, this din. You can't tell a ger schar masachar yishanim. So you can't tell it to Rus herself. So you can't tell Dovid, who didn't even do anything wrong himself. There's nothing wrong with him. Why would that be something to tell him? The Rebbe, no, there is something wrong with Dovid because he's an Einakol of Rus. Even though Gershon is Garka Katan Shnei Dami, but there is this Leida, this rebirth, whatever it is, there is a Reishim from the previous Matzav. And the Gemara says Sureira, and a Ger needs to have a bigger Zehirus, just like about Shuva, has to say Efshi. It's quoting from the Torah Taka Pashas Veschanan, very apt, very apropos. Maybe Taka something in the Torah to look into in its own right. But in the Torah states that about Shuva has to say Efshi b'chtei shelo yipro chas v'shalom. So if that's the case with the Baal Shuva, so the same is the case with the Ger. And therefore, if they would tell Dovid, Chazar la'achirecha, you have a doifi, you come from Rus, It's not just to taunt him, but that would be coming out of care and concern. Dovid, you have to be careful. You have to look after yourself. You're like a Baal Tshuva, like the Baal Tshuva from the Torah, and you need extra zehirus. And this is not something you could tell Shaul. Shaul was a tzaddik; he didn't need the zehirus. So it ultimately all comes together, being the way that Rebbe explains it, is the doif mishpacha ends up being a personal flaw, something that Dovid has to look out for. And let's talk. It says that Dovid spilled blood and he can't build a bias l'shmi. L'chayda, what's the taina? Mechamas mitzvah. But no, it does reflect on him. It does reflect on him in some way. And if his avoda is bekava gvura, so he has certain challenges and certain struggles that are unique to having that type of personality and that type of kav. And now this that sounds like a flaw. Dovid has a flaw, a struggle, a doifi mishpacha. Now we're coming and telling you that this is dafka mile, this is dafka prerequisite for a successful malchus. So Dovid had the kupa shel shratzim, he had the doifi mishpacha, which meant also whatever that meant personally for him, and that made him successful. And malchus beis Shaul, because there was no doifi, it was too clean, it was too pure. The Rebbe says, even though Shaul b'tzad atzmei was very great, and he was supposed to be the one to effectuate mechias Amalek, and mechias Amalek beruchnius is a tremendous thing. So Shaul being the one selected for it tells you something about Shaul. And there's an opinion that says that Dafka Shaul was a rishon lamalachim. They're mitzayin to the few midrashim that Shaul is described as rishon lamalachim. It's not like we erase his whole legacy and his whole heritage. No, he is Taka, the first king. And we don't call Dovid that, we call Shaul that. And yet, Shaul, and signed to another Maimer Chazal as well, that Dafka, the kings that were nimshach bepach, with oil, why? Because the king needs to be a parnas al tzibur, and he needs to interact with the tzibur and deal with them and tolerate them, just like Moshe dealt with the Yidden, who also weren't so easy to handle. The Mitzayner to Parshas Devarim, which we just came from, Torchachem, etc. So that means that he has to have a shaychus, he has to be able to relate to the Maimer Matzav of the Tzibur, and then you can be a parnas, mashenkin if you're hecher from them. And the Rebbe Taka invokes the Ma'aser, the Mittel Rebbe. Someone asked him in Yechidus about something that Mittel Rebbe had no shaychus to, and he couldn't respond to him until he found the Badakas, because as long as you don't find this inyan, then you can't be a parnas for this person, for this mensch, for this yid. And that's the tam that's in the midin parnas al tzibur, because without that you don't have a shaychus. But it has to be me'achayrav, the same emphasis mamash in the letter. But you see in the letter Bekitzer, you see here by Riches, as far as I could tell, they were not mitzayin here in the sicha to that letter, which is an oversight, especially if you're trying to trace the Rebbe's ideas and after some of the lesser known ideas. Obviously, there's certain things that Rebbe repeated countless times, but to me, sometimes there's an extra interest and geschmack to find a theme that the Rebbe mentioned 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and many years apart. So this is an example of that. But and also what the Rebbe is saying about leadership, about what it means to be a Rebbe itself, has interesting ramifications that is a bit different perhaps than the usual themes that are emphasized. But the Rebbe is saying that, back to the Vart, Kubishal Shatzim has to be me'achayrav. If it's lafanav, then you're not worthy of being a parnas. You have to first fix yourself, work on yourself. It has to be that it's behind you. You already did shuvah, it's in the rear view mirror, it's behind you, chazar la'acherecha. When they taunt you, it's also chazar la'acherecha. See, the kupa shel shatzan was there before, and then you can be mashpia and poil on the tzibur, even those that are very lowly. So that way you can find a point of commonality even with people like that. There's something shared, there's something in common, there's the possibility for being able to relate. And here the Rebbe connects it to a larger point, which is also very interesting, and I was thinking about it to cover Parshas Matos, didn't end up recording anything about it, but definitely an interesting topic about tzadikim. Tzadikim can use dvarim hamutarim, and that's the Yerushalmi that says that you'll be asked in Shemayim about not being nana. That's for tzadikim, whereas Balei Tshuva, they have to be very careful, you have to be nizer, me'esharim shalater. This is a very strong Parshas Matos Shama via his Nidra theme in Chassidus Chabad. And so the Rebbe seems to be tying that and connecting that to this model of Dovid versus Shaul. And then if this is Befratius, really every Yid has this as a microcosm. Sometimes a Yid is more of a tzaddik, sometimes a Yid is more of a Baal Tshuva, which itself is an interesting point. And on the bottom they write chaser k'tzas, so dafka, interesting, tantalizing thought and idea. And apparently the Rebbe quoted that there's a line from the Fidig Rebbe quoting the Rebbe Lashab that lo yesh ata seder v'adrag beifane habirudim. Some of the altis dorim are no longer applicable, so you have to be oisik and all kinds of avoida, which is a interesting point. Sounds like something that the Rebbe would say, and probably ties into other things that Rebbe said over the years, but needs to be properly unpacked separately. But that's another point that Rebbe connected and attached to this previous discussion. And then the Rebbe went on to connect this idea back to the questions about Dovid, Yolles, avodah of tzadikim al tshuva, but that's already beyond our focus here. But look it up, Ayin Sham. What's fascinating is that there's another Chabad Mocker that was not Nisman, not in the letter of the Rebbe, not in Teres Menachem, Tashan Chav Daled, but may or may not have been something that the Rebbe had seen and would have been referencing, although not directly, is that there is actually a Torah printed among the Torahs of the Alter Rebbe. It's printed in the Mori Adam Razakein in Yonim, because it starts off Lahavin Inyan, which is a genre that I think I've already discussed. We spoke about it a little bit in the discussion of Lahavin Kushas HaToichnim. So there was once a set of Mamorim, Mamori Admar Zaken in Yonim, one volume, and then a few years ago they reprinted it as 2 volumes with Ha'aris on the bottom. So now it's in Chelik Beis. Originally it was page Shin Tzadik Beis, now it's page Tav Kuf Samach Beis. And it begins, Lahavin Inyan Shaul v'Dovid, it's Mamish a Torah, a beer of the Alter Rebbe on Shaul versus Dovid, and it begins that we talk that Nishmas Shaul was higher than Nishmas Dovid, Gavaya Harbe. And the Alter Rebbe, well, actually, I should point out in the footnote, they say, it's not clear if it's the Alter Rebbe or the Mitzvah Rebbe, but at any rate, it's the Alter Rebbe. So it brings Rayas and fits it into the Kabbalistic framework and different Lashonis, different Psukim of Shaul's Darga versus Dovid's. And then the way the Alter Rebbe was on to explain it is, so Dafka, because Shaul was so high, so Dafka, Chet Kalma Oid, Hiziklai. So when he was takanichshel in something small, that was much more harmful. Why was he punished so harshly? And Dovid sinned many more times, and benistachle miyad. But Inyan Hu, the Hiyanesenes, because he was so high and so great, so he couldn't tolerate any pseilas, even avoin dak ma'oid. This is what we find with the Neshamas Hagvayim ma'oid. And the Derech Mashal, the Mayach and the Roish can't tolerate shmutz the way other parts of the and the yahrzeit, the klei ha'ai, and the eye is very sensitive. Can't tolerate any psoilus that enters the eye. The eye can't take it. And similarly for the evarim apnimiyim, the sensitive inner evarim, mashenk, and the evarim achitzonim magasim, more external limbs can take a lot of abuse and a lot of psoilus, whereas the more inner sensitive organs are a lot more sensitive and can collapse from the wrong psoilus entering. And here Taka throws in the line, that a parnas has to be of this more yivorim achitzonim vegasim nature, and that's the kupashal shratzim. They have to be able to build up a tolerance for stuff, and that's Taka why Dovid chatakam because Nefesh Dovid is lamata madrig min Nefesh Shaul. So kibel the saval psoilus ha'oven v'lo yizik lekol kach. He called it gevaya yoser lo yuchal lisboil. So that's the nakuda of this Torah of this beer of the Alter Rebbe, written by the Mittel Rebbe. And so it's interesting to compare the way the Hezbollah is written here to the way that Rebbe repeated it, and to see whether there's any direct connection or at least any strong parallels, whether there are any other sources that Rebbe could have seen that say something similar. I'll just point out that the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, and he uses the concept that maybe we touched on briefly for Parsha Shlach, Anshe Midos, where here the Alter Rebbe emphasizes this idea that Anshe Midos means that they have Midos Gedolos, Midos to tell you if you're of overwhelming chesed or overwhelming gvura, you can't function. You need to have midas ktanas, and Shaul had midas gdoilas, and Dovid had midas ktanas. So Dovid had the right midas and the right proportions for being able to fear the malucha as opposed to Shaul. Ayin Sham, how he ties it all in. So it's interesting as well, since the Rebbe later pretty much directly connected, certainly in this letter to Yolles, seemed to directly connect it to how leadership in our day and age is supposed to work. And the Rebbe essentially explicitly ties it into the concept of Rebbistva, and both in the letter and in the Sikha, ties it into the story of the Mitzvah Rebbe. So it's interesting to also think about how this Torah of the Alter Rebbe also fits in, and was the Alter Rebbe also being meramis and being mechaven, even though it doesn't seem to spell it out, is that Alter Rebbe also consciously being mechaven to give direction, to give a framework for hanhaga that works versus hanhaga that doesn't work. It's also interesting, I guess, to take this framework and try to apply it to various modes and means of manhigos, hanhaga, in today's day and age. Meaning, obviously, you have tzadikim that are removed and aren't actively attempting to have an active role in hanhaga. Maybe that was the context in the letter, like I said, but certainly there are examples, Shaul being the first, of someone who was attempting to fear malchus but wasn't the right fit, and could very well be the Armanhigim today, who are making a mistake somewhere along these lines, where they're running the show more like Shaul rather than more like Dovid, Lefi the Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe's framework. And it's interesting to point out, you have letters from the Rebbe about television, about things of this nature, where you have Rabbanim wrote to the Rebbe about asering the shchit of someone who has television, and the Rebbe wrote back and said that it's too intolerant, and it's not practical, doesn't make sense. And you have kreisen that perhaps you could say, I don't know if you can say they're ever shrinking, and this is its own sociological observation that has to be said accurately and fine-tuned, but you have certain kreisen that are ostensibly Haredi, but they feel so tight and so stifling, and the people inside, it's not working for them, and it expresses itself in different ways, but it's not lefi the midas, let's say maybe it's midas gedoilas, or it's not tolerating any chet, even the slightest chet, whatever hagdara you want to give, that and whatever the outcome, whatever the negative outcomes, whatever shape, whatever form they take, whether the people leave, or whether the people on the inside start behaving in ways that is expressing their stress and their distress. It's possible to see this problem, to see this flaw in certain models and modes of hanhaga, versus it seems like the Rebbe's mahalach throughout the years, and this is a topic that comes up in different forms, how tolerant was the Rebbe, does Chabad have standards, should Chabad have standards, and this is a large discussion, but certainly to a certain extent, you see that the Rebbe, as we touched on also more recently, about Gedolim Amal, that felt achrayus for Klal Yisrael versus Gedolim today. They don't, when they say Klal Yisrael, they mean their immediate circle. They don't mean Gans Klal Yisrael, all Orthodox Jews or all Jews Bechlal. And the Rebbe kept that model of achrayus for Gans Klal Yisrael in the literal sense, and that means tolerating many more things and being able to relate to many more Jews than your average Haredi leader seems to be capable of doing. And so this is these themes crop up and can be identified and analyzed in many different ways, many different places, but it all seems to be connected and tie in. So it's interesting how the Rebbe is expressing it, how the Alter Rebbe is expressing it, how the Rebbe is expressing it, and the implications, though, for the manik himself, for the leader himself, as to what shapes a manik, what makes it possible for a manik to be able to relate to others. Obviously, we're not experts on neshamas, and to attempt to suggest any spiritual hagdaras would be completely beyond what's my place to do, and certainly I'm not even contemplating it. But what the Alter Rebbe and the Rebbe seem to be saying does sound intriguing, does sound interesting. Like I said, it's not usually the aspect of Rebbe, of Hanhaga that's usually discussed, emphasized, spoken about, but it seems to be cropping up here and being hinted to, alluded to, and it's certainly intriguing to think about. And I imagine there probably are other Makoros, maybe that don't use the Dovid Shaul, Kupa Shel Shratzim framework, but that are probably expressing similar ideas. Surely it crops up in other places as well. Maybe I'm even forgetting something right now that I should be remembering. If anyone has any other tziyunim or mekoros on this topic that ties into this, I'd be very happy to hear. And now to circle back around to the topic of the Bala Yahrzeit himself, Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles. I'm looking right now. I have the Sharblat of the Sefer of his son, Shaul Tzuvas David Ephraim Eliezer Midur Kama, Tafshin Mem Gimel, where he gives his name, Ephraim Eliezer Kohen Yolles, the son of, and he uses similar lashonis to the lashon of the Matzeva, Shalom HaKohen, Moran Shalom HaKohen Zatzal Lebeis Yolles, that was a Rav Abeis and Shalosh Kilos Kadeshus, Benoy Shal Haisab Kadish and Tzadik Zerayim Levasadar Rabbeinu Uri Kana Rabbim is Sambor. So to try to get a bit more context, a bit more of the background as to what is Sambor, who is his father, why is he sometimes called an Admor, sometimes not. So I'm not claiming to be a huge expert on the topic, not something that I have studied for years and years. But if you take a look at this Sefer, Shut David Ephraim Eliezer, and you look at the Rosh Davar, you'll see that Rav Yolles himself did a decent, fine job giving some background into himself and into his family. He says, Lamale Drishas, Chasni Kabni, etc. Ershem Khan is a Kavim Yitolis Avoisa Goinim Tzadikim. And he starts from his Zayda, Tzadik Reb Uri HaKohen, born in Lvov, Tovkov Tzadik Beis, to his father, Rav Chassid of Makubal, Ephraim Tzvi, Mishpachas Yolles, or Yalish, is a Mishpach Miyuchasas, Shalshalas Kuhuna, till Rabbeinu Yeshaya Kohen Tzedek, Me'achrone Bali HaTosfos, brought a few times the Shita encompasses. Interesting yichus, interesting claim of yichus. And he says, the Alta Zayda, Ephraim Tzvi, already was Makosher to Reb Uri, the sort of Strelesk, till the day of his Petira. Amos is Alta Zayda, already Ephraim Tzvi, gehalten by Madrega, that he could have feared Chassidim after his Rebbe Reb Uri of Strelesk passed away, but Lamaisa he didn't. Akapanim, his Zayda, Reb Uri HaKohen, was named after his Alta Zayda's Rebbe Reb Uri of Strelesk, passed away a few years before his son Reb Uri was born. He says Takas, his Zayda Reb Uri grew up in the Strelesk, Stratton, Chassidus, in that context. And then a bit later, he went to check out Bells. He spent a lot of time by the Sar Shalom of Bells to check out that style of Chassidus. And he writes about it as Shtikl Barichas. We're going to be Makatze here. And he writes a whole story how it came to be that the Sar Shalom, Le'ezik Nosai, told him that Stayid, was at Gili Eliyahu, and Farahei Machtech an Egen Minyan, and das haben a Ben Chacham. So he had a tzivoy of the Belzer to make his own minyan. And the Sar Shalom Taka passed away shortly afterwards, and essentially started fearing an Eid Chassidim based on that. Seems like it was still a dur, Tofrish Tezvav, it was still an era within the history of Polish Chassidus where it was still fairly common for Talmidim to still start an Egen Chassidus that I guess kept on for longer in Poland than it did necessarily in Ukraine and Russia. But as I come to that was still it's like gefiert in Poland, and that's an example of that, because he wasn't coming mamish from his father. Could have been a Rebbe, but Itaka went ahead and started up what was essentially an Ayach Chassidus. Describes how as soon as that happened, though, he still had to have a Rebbe over him, which is also interesting about the dynamic in Poland. You had Rebbes who consider other greater Rebbes to be their Rebbes. Very interesting dynamic. Those who spend time reading through the literature, it's pretty clear. Maybe there's more to it, but at least Bekitzer, that's the dynamic. So he went back to his origins. His origins were Strelesk Stratton. So then he went to be Makabel Moros of Avraham of Stratton. And that itself seems like an interesting dynamic of toggling between Strelisk, Stretten, and Bells. Then in Tafresh Tezayin, Yitaka had his son, was the second son. He had a son that was born earlier, but the Sar Shalom had promised him a Ben Chacham, and Tafresh Tezayin, he had a second son. He named him Taka after the Sar Shalom, and that's Reb Shalom Hakai and Yolles that we are concerned with here, that we're focusing on here. Very interestingly, on the point of the model of Rebistve in Poland and the model of Talmidim continuing for later there than it did elsewhere, on the next page, Yitaka writes that in the summer of Tafresh Chavdalet, before Mincha, his Rebbe, the tzaddik of Stretten, was sitting in his room and was talking with the Chassidim, the Elter Chassidim. So one Elter Chassid, who was still noch from the Chassidim of the original Rebbe of Strelisk, asked the tzaddik of Avramcha of Stretten, Bezel Lashon Rebbe, from Baal Shem Tov Seiten, hat a Talmud, or the Talmidim, Memala Makim Gewen dem Rebbe, dem Sitcha Magid, dem Baal Shem, the Chavraya Kaddish, dem Rebbe Rebbe, die Tzadiki Poilen, dem Rebbe Rebbe Melech Milizensk, und Rebbe soll gesund sein, ist nicht nur a Sohn von Friedrich Rebbe, euch a Talmud von Rebbe dem Saraf, aber in der heutigen Zeiten hören wir als Kinder neben über die Rebistve. So, as late as Tafresh Chavdaled, one of the Elter Chassidim is like asking it, posing it as a question. And almost from the Nusach HaShayla, the way Rebbe Ephraim Eliezer preserved it, it sounds like it's almost like a Tmiyah. What's Taka Pshat? Just the tzaddik sat quietly for a few moments and didn't answer. Suddenly, he opened the nearby window, and he saw that Rebbe Urele, the Zayda of Rebbe Ephraim Eliezer, is running from the mikveh to Mincha. He called him to come in, and he came in, and he told him, Urele, will sein Rebbe? He was quiet. So he turned to the Chassidim, and he said, Schreibt euch kvitlach und langt Rebbe Urin, and you sit with me, and that's what they did. He says, Ephraim Eliezer says, I noch heard this story from the Elter Chassid, Akiva Egus, who was there at that Maimed. And the context here is that Rav Yolles wrote earlier that even though the Belzer had told him to start a minyan, but he hadn't been taking kvitlach. He would only take geld for tzedakah. He called himself a gabbai tzedakah. And going to the Stretener was also sort of his way of, he's not really fully following Rebbe. And this Stretener technically was a son of the previous one. So that's where the story comes in, where they're having this discussion. Is it Talmidim or is it sons? And so this Stretener, who's both a son and a Talmud, pulls this Rebbe Uri in, who's not the son, but a Talmud, and says, Dafke to give kvitlach to him. Says, Lamaisa on the spot, the kvitlach they gave to him, he just handed over to his Rebbe, Bavramsha of Stretten. But then when this Rebbe also passed away, Tafresh Chavei, then he started taking kvitlach from the Chassidim, and for anyone who came to him, and he became a proper Rebbe, and they used to tell moifsim about him, etc. But in continuing with this interesting dynamic in Poland that I described, both overlapping, going to multiple tzadikim, and second-tier tzadikim having first-tier Rebbes above them, so after the Stretener passed away, then he started going to Sadiger, the son of the Ruzhiner. And as we'll see, that informs the gather of the Mishpacha and who they were connected to in the next door. Rav Yolles writes that he once met a Rav who related that he had bumped into his Zayda Rebbe Uri, and he was traveling to Sadiger, or while he was traveling, and he asked him, why are you going to Sadiger? B'stocha b'vusta Rebbe yourself. So Rebbe Uri told him that Shteit Novis Reb Nosson, that you have to learn from three. For example, Rebbe Eliezer B'shur Rebbe Kiva. You have to have three Rebbes. So he asked him, Rav asked him, but Bells and Stretten are so different from Ruzhin and Sadiger. Like, how do you fit them all in together? So he said that's just b'vchinas levush. B'vchinas levush they're different, but b'pnimiyas adraba v'adraba. So this also gives some insight to me. It's also like a sociological vart as to how this worked, what this dynamic was in Poland at that time, and this cross-traveling and belonging and having a shaykhs to multiple hyphen, even though at least officially b'chitzonius, b'vchinas levush, they seem pretty different in their hanhaga. Now, this Rebbe Uri was a Rebbe in different places, but in Tafresh Lamed Ches, P the Eitzah of the Sadiger, Yitaka moved to Sambor, and that's why he's known as Rebbe Uri of Sambor. He says, Alfe Veruvis Yisrael from Galicia and Ungarin used to come to Rebbe Uri in Sambor to get brachas, Eitzah V'Sushia. Rav Yolles himself mentions that he himself, growing up, got to spend time with his Zayda and talk to his Zayda, and he describes that in Tafresh Ayin, in 1910, his Zayda's digestive system shut down inexplicably. It wasn't clear why, but nifsa koyach ha'ikol, and he lasted 40 days, and he continued his avodah, but ultimately he passed away that year, Adar Sheni. Had a big levaya, describes it as a big levaya, and then after the levaya, so his father, Reb Shalom's older brother and younger brother, took kvitlach, and his father, Reb Shalom, refused to take kvitlach. It wasn't clear why, considering that they were connected to Ruzhin Tzadiger. So by then that included Bayan, and the Bayaner wrote a michtav tanchumim and wrote to him, "Vayini seimich yodai alav sheisnag b'chol derech aviv harav hakadosh." So that was implying that he should continue the Rebbe, and when he received the letter, he started taking kvitlach, and he also received letters from the chart cover, also from Ruzhin, and from Pesach of Bells as well, to be mamshech the Rebbe. So aside from Bayan Chartkov, aside from Bells, he was being encouraged to continue the Rebbe in some way. And here's where he gets to the biography taka of his father. He says, my father, Shalom HaKayin, was an Ilui from childhood. They said when he was bar mitzvah, Chaf Eyad Tavish Chavtas, he was Baki Shulchan Aruch Yerideyach, Chelik Aleph, Tas Shach, Pirim Agadim, as well as Kama Halachas Nechutzes and Shulchan Aruch Yerachayim. When he was young, he went to the Beis Medrash of the Goyner Dor, the Beis Yitzchak Shmelkes, who was the Rav in Pramishla, if that's how you pronounce it, Chodesh Elo Tavish Lamed Beis. He married his wife, my mother, Rabbi Yolles' mother. He describes that he was Meshamish, the two Goyni Doire, the Shalom Meshav and Lavav, and the Divrei Chaim and Tzanz. And in Tafrei Shmem, he got real, proper smicha from the Beis Yitzchak, Lahira, Uledin, Ke'echad HaRabbanim HaMuvhakim. And Tafrei Shmem Gimel, he got his first Rabbanos in Ir Chodosh, presumably a translation of Neustadt or something in Polish, near Premisla, near where his Rebbe lived. He wanted to be near his Rebbe so he can still hear Shiurim from his Rebbe. And his Rabbeim and Tefillah and Chasidus, he writes Chasidus de Rabbeinu Abal Shem Tov, were Saya's father, and gives the whole Sheshalis of who his father was Makabal from, again. So he was Makabal from his father, Taker, Raburi, but he was also very connected to the Sadigerer, and he shares some information relating to that. Now he was there in Tafresh Mugim when the Sadigerer passed away. Kitzer came back to Ir Chodosh. He started a yeshiva, Talmidim Muflagim, could feed the Alta Derech of yeshivas in Poland and those dairas, sort of the informal yeshiva where the Bacharim would gather around the Rav, and the Rav would give shiurim, but it wasn't an official yeshiva with a name, the Chadaima, and that itself is its own interesting history, the history of yeshivas in different medinas and different zmanim. But at this time, this was still working, still how it worked. And the focus in this yeshiva was Birur Hilchas Arba Chalkei Shulchan Aruch Pi Mekaydes Rishonim. Then in Tavish Nun Vav 1896 he upgraded to Rabbanos in Mashtisk. Ir Shekula Chachamim V'Seifrim. He was Memal Makam Achashav Rav. And then in Tavish Samach Dalad, when the Hari Besamim, whose shuvas we've quoted in previous episodes, and he was the Rav in Stryi, so but the Hari Besamim upgraded himself in Tavish Samadal 1904. So then, who replaced him in Stryi? Reb Shalom HaKayin Yolles. Bechlal, Stryi is a very chashuv in terms of Rabbanim. He himself mentions here it's the city where the Ktsois was the Rav, the Chavis Das. A long list of very, very well-known chashuv Perlish Rabbanim were Rabbanim in Stryi. So I guess one would have to study the history of Stryi to understand how they ended up, what their role was economically, and what kind of kehillah they had. But they had chashuv Rabbanim, and it's like a chashuv Azak l'chayra, that he was Mamala Makim, the Hari Besamim, and these other chashuv Rabbanim taka in Stryi. And then fast forwarding to this Tkufa taka, to his Petira, it says here Tafresh Peidaled, after Pesach he traveled. But l'chayr, there's a typo here because he's describing his final travels, and this is, as we know, Tafresh Pehei, not Tafresh Peidaled. So maybe the leg of the hay is missing in this in the sefer, in this image. So Tafresh Pehei, after Pesach he traveled to Eretz Yisrael. It's not the way he writes it. A bikur makes it sound like it wasn't Manas Lishtakeya. Not 100% clear, but he went to Eretz Yisrael. He went to the Kivrei Avis, became Sakdoshim. They're machabed him to be madlik the Lakar Rishon and Lag Ba'omer. We know Bechlal the Ruzhin Hoifen Bayan Adi Yamazeh have a shaykhus to Lag Ba'omer Miron. They were machabed him. When he came back to Yerushalayim, he came down with a terrible machla, and he just kept on saying, Yisuri Eretz Yisrael, Yisuri Eretz Yisrael. Early Yom, Erev Shabbos Kodesh, Motzei Tisha B'Av, he repeated to someone there the last thing he heard when he was by his Rebbe, the Sadiger, is passing. Then he said, Tata, and he passed away. And as we saw talking in the newspaper as well, Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld gave the hesped, and he was nitban Bahar Azesim near the Tzion of the Teres Chesed. Yolles himself, who maybe he writes it earlier, or maybe not, but Yolles himself had already immigrated to America a few years earlier, and that's its own story. But he had already immigrated to America, but at that point already it was easy, it was possible to send news quickly. So he received the news taka that day, Yom Erev Shabbos Kodesh V'Eschana Yud Menachem Av, when he heard that his father passed away, and about the Levaya. So he says he was reminded of different anecdotes relating to this. One of the things he was reminded of is that his father told him that many years earlier, sounds pretty much like when he was a younger man, he went to Carlsbad, the healing waters of Carlsbad that were all the rage at the time, all the Gedolim went to them, etc. When he came there, he met other Gedolim. He met the Teres Chesed. That was his meeting, his introduction to the Teres Chesed, who was ended up already of Lublin, who also came to Carlsbad. And after just a short conversation, he, mamish, felt completely connected to the Teres Chesed. He was mishamish him all 3 weeks. They were together in one achsanya, and he says his father would always say, Shalom would always say, I saw the Shalom Eshev, I learned by my Rebbe, the Beis Yitzchak, but Azar Goin, I never met. So he felt he had a connection to the Teres Chesed, so maybe that was why he thought of it, because they buried him samach v'nira to the tzion of the Teres Chesed. At any rate, this description doesn't fully give us insight into what exactly his maimed was and the dynamic. It seems like with whatever kfitlach he was taking, it seems like it remained somewhat secondary. Maybe other members of the family's involvement as Atzmam Shichim of Sambor was stronger. I didn't delve too deeply into it, but it seems like he followed, he accepted to whatever extent he took kfitlach, but it doesn't seem like that was his main inyan. But his main inyan was that the Taka spent years being oisik in Hira, getting nismach l'Hira, and teaching Hira. That seems to have been his main inyan. And he remained connected to Bayan. Seems like Ruzhim, his Ruzhin Haifen, were what he remained connected to Be'ikr, more so, and I think Bells less so. If you search his name, a number of Ruzhin Tzadiger Bayan Sfarim come up. One of them is called Mishkanis Haroyim, and it contains a section called Kisvei HaChasidim of the year Tafresh Pehei, Taka this year, that Shalom HaKohen Yolles passed away. And it's like a yeman of what was happening in Bayan. And they write, Arav Mistri, they write Malchus Shepet Tefaris, which is Vav Ir, Tafresh Pehei, they write, Arav Mistri was here this week on his way to Eretz Yisrael, and he shared that there was supposed to be Epis and for this year on the Vav of a number of people who also want to go up to Eretz Yisrael, including certain Chassidim. And whoever's writing this writes, No lo hidieni ma nigmar b'sham. So it seems like more like one chassid writing to another chassid, and the Rav of Stri shared this information. I'm curious to hear more about it. Because they include this line, because the Rav of Stri showed up in Bayan on the way and it got recorded, so they write a whole ara surveying his life, Bekitzer, based on what Rav Yolles wrote. And they write that he was very chaviv, Eitzel Moron HaPachad Yitzchak of Bayan. And there's different, you have to go and delve into the tree of Bayan. There's Bayan Chernovitz, Bayan Leipzig, and it seems like he was be'ikr connected to this cluster of rabbis. Taka there in footnote 7, they bring other evidence that this trip was Taka meant to be more of a temporary trip, even though the newspaper made it sound like Ola La'aretz Yisrael. It sort of implies, or you can understand that he made Aliyah. But as Rav Yolles wrote in his Sefer, it was a Bikur, and they cite here as well that another son of Rav Shalom HaKohen Yolles had also written around that time that my father wants to make an Asiyah after Pesach, because many years he wants to go through the Daled Amos, Eretz HaKodesha, the Spal Mekemes HaKodesha. And originally he thought he'd do the trip together with the chart cover, but that's not going to work out. And meanwhile now, the Bayaner in Chernovitz wants that Shalom, Makoy, and Yolles should travel through Chernovitz on the way. So that's why Taka, he stopped off in Chernovitz, and that's why whoever it was, whichever chassid it was, Taka wrote down that, the Rav Stryi was here, referring to Chernovitz by the Bayaner. And they write, Taka Chassid Bayaner and Yisrael were very happy to meet him, and then suddenly he fell ill and he passed away. Matzidishabov, Liyoim Vav, Erev Shabbos Kodesh V'Chan Shabbos Nachmu. He's buried in Harzeisim, near the Teiras Chassid, who he was Meshamish, and it was Nisbar Rabbi Yosef Chaim Zonnefeld, the same information that we've seen already in multiple places. So this all gives the necessary context to understand and appreciate the fact that his son, from Eliezer Yolles, is writing to the Rebbe in Tafshin Yud Beis about the yahrzeit Yud Menachem of, clearly of his father, and this gives us some context into who his father was, where his father came from, what his father's inyan and mahus was. I'll mention one other thing I saw in the newspapers at that time. I was searching through the newspapers to see if he was mentioned Bechlal or Befrat around this time. I didn't see that many mentions, so that leads into a larger point, which is it's hard to gauge, it's hard to be mashayar a person's exact madrega and a person's exact maimed, madrega meaning taka, what he taka reached and accomplished and achieved, and how he compared to other rabbanim and benon shel kadoshim at that time. I can't give an evaluation, a mark, a rating. And also the maimed, to what extent was he a rav that was boilet, that stood out at the time as one of the great rabbanim? It's hard for me to say again. Maybe there are others who understand better, but from searching around, it doesn't seem like his name is mentioned so much. But that doesn't necessarily tell you. There could be rabbanim that just don't get a lot of PR, or there could be rabbanim that are gedolim mamish, and the taka are more overlooked, even b'chayayim. So it's hard to say exactly. Don't know for sure. But adrab, the fact that he seems to be somewhat overlooked, and no one is making a trask and a shtorim of Me'ashana, that in a way strengthens my geschmack in focusing on someone overlooked like this. So I saw one ad taka that was printed in one of the newspapers in Poland a few months earlier. I don't have the exact date in front of me, but it was around the month that he went up. So a number of people, Mordechai Meller, Yachmiel Ratter, there's a bunch of Yidden. They put an ad in the paper, they wrote Birkas Haderech. Anachnu chasumim matom avarchem bezes kvoida denenu marenu v'rabenu rav agoyin atzadik maran shalom. And then I'm not sure if this is just a pashut typo because it says shin lamed yud vav, or if there is some kind of nickname based on shalom that would be spelled that way. I don't know. But Hakoyin Yolles with a komat shlita this community of Stryi ben Rav HaKadosh Mefursam Rabbeinu Uri Hakoyin Sambor. Zatzal, Yoim Aloisoi Al Hasfina, gives the name of the ship. Hayoitzes Beyoim Yud Ir Havalin Latevim Costanza Lochof Yafo, Yashem Ima V'Yalar Etzakesh Levaker, Mekayim Sakodeshim, Yitzesa Uvoy L'Shalom, they were definitely expecting him back. Ka'avas Nafshes Klanchi Shleimoi, Chutz La'aretz V'Nefesh Talmidav of Hakim Poistri, signed by these 8 chevre. I don't know what their chshivas and significance was, but that is another thing I found relating to this travel. So it does seem like the fact that he fell ill and passed away was a bit of a shock and not expected, and it was not like he had made aliyah in order to settle there either. But that's the story, that's the Maisa, and Lamafreya probably looked like Epis Agadlos, that he traveled to Eretz Yisrael and immediately he was nifter or was buried there, which wasn't the plan. That itself could have come across as Epis Advar Pella, Agadlos, and could have contributed to how he was seen and perceived. Speaking of his madrega in Torah, so part of the problem is also that we don't have too much in Torah from him either. There is one kuntris that's called Sifsei Shalom that was printed in a few places. Among others, it's scattered throughout the sefer of his son, Rav Yolles of Philadelphia, not as one collection, but scattered throughout. But today, it's reprinted in a sefer called Kaddish. Kaddish is dedicated to the Shishalas. It's officially about his father, the Uri of Sambor. But in it, they include this material as well. It's printed by rabbinical, who apparently considers himself to be Epis HaHemshech of Sambor. I didn't go checking to see if Ruftzich Rebbe, Tzinisht, but there is Epis HaHemshech to Sambor. And not through Rav Yolles of Philadelphia, but through, I think a son-in-law, a brother-in-law of Rav Yolles, one of the descendants through there. So they reprinted the Sifsei Shalom, and in Sifsei Shalom they have six shuvas and one shuva ktsara of Rav Yolles. So I just wanted to, sample them lightly and briefly. We're not going to delve too deeply into them, but just to blend that in a little bit. Simon Aleph, Stryi Tafresh Samach Tes. He was asked from Kamarna, which the family had a shaykhus to as well. I believe it said his father, the Buri, had been in Kamarna. That there was a shaykhet who signed his name on a ksav with another shaykhet. And then they were tining that he was over on the ksav, and without even getting into the mamayna shabazeh, he says, you're asking about the Yana Yisura. Was he over on what he wrote the ksav? The title of the simon is Bedin Shvua B'Ksav V'Hamistayif. It gets into the whole story and the Shaklavataya. It's a longer tshuva. We're not going to get into it, but it's interesting to see these types of questions. It's taka written with a great lafiyadach, a great arichas, yud ches oisius, and there's a siyuma to pascha at the end with 8 short oisius. And just looking at it superficially, it looks like it's written with a certain arichas and a certain klarkeit. If I may say my theory, my sense is that it shows a certain mumchias in Inyoni Chayshim Mishpat. Maybe he was someone, although technically he said it's not an Inyoni Chayshim Mishpat, it's Inyoni D'Yisura, being over on a Shvu B'Ksav. But it looks like he had a certain mumchias to Inyoni Sichsuchim and to write a lengthy psak that's menumuk that would be satisfactory and clear. So that's what comes across from looking at it. At any rate, but to get to the question, he certainly was lenient that we can't passel him for being over on what he wrote. That's not the issue, and as he explains there by Arichos. Interestingly, Simon Beis is a pretty similar type of shaila. Stryi, this one's dated Tafresh Ayin. Chanukah Tafresh Ayin. Keep in mind, that means that these first 2 tshuvas were written while his father was still alive, and he's mamish only known al Tarov, and this shaila, this tshuva written to somewhere else, also is about this type of thing. Shachtim, they wrote a ksav, and they made a certain commitment, and they said, we're not going to do X, Y, and Z, and it's a neder gomer, al das rabim, ein lehat Torah Yolamis. It, again, is interesting to see, and it clearly is a pattern, clearly was very common at that time, and I think this comes up in many other sifrei shalos tshuvas over the era as well. And again, they regretted writing that, and they felt like they had to override what they wrote. But how do you deal with Azan Neder B'Ksav Neder B'Loshen? The title is then Neder B'Loshen Shvua U'B'Nyonim HaMistafim. So these are the types of shalos that kept coming up, and apparently were being sent to him. Again, we're not going to delve too deeply into it. Interesting in his base, he writes Omnam Re'isi L'Moidi Hagoyin Mo'aritz Shmalkaz Atzal B'Sifroi Da. His Dal, he writes U'B'Derech Agav Heirani B'Ni HaChoref Hagadol Kamar Efraim Eliezer Ner Yor. So referring to Rav Yolles, who we are most familiar with. And once again, he concluded lahater, that you could be mater what they committed to. From Kol Zois le'afsek kanalacha brura, he's writing to the Rav that asked them, you look into it again and you decide. Simon Gimel is a bit shorter and a bit more interesting. I thought I would share it. Simon Gimel is b'inyan lahamit muna al matzevas kever b'beis hachayim, whether you could put a picture on a matzeva. I think in particular, if you go to Yiddish Batekvaris, you'll see that Russian Yidden that were in Russia under the Soviets had this minhag. They would put pictures on matzevis, and sometimes even a Yid with a bard, like a from a Yid, when he passed away, his children who were a little less from, they would put his picture with the bard on. But certainly the next datus, and you see it, I think even here in Brooklyn, you go to Batekvaris and you see if there are kfarim there of Soviet Jews, you'll see pictures. So interesting to see the history of this. The history of matzevis, Jewish matzevis in general, is a fascinating topic, and the evolution over the last 2,000 years, and different forks in the road, different directions, different kehillas, different communities, different locales went with. So it was interesting to see that this question came up, and the dafka came up, it seems, mamish in his own kehillah, in Stryi, in Tafresh Samach Tes. He was asked by the alufim and the ktzinim, still using those terms, Nisiye kahal adosenu Stryi, and they were asking if al pi din Teresenu Akdaisha, you're allowed to put a tmuna photografia al matzevas kever achad beis hachayim. I'm guessing the alufim and the ktzinim weren't looking and seeking to do so themselves. Mistam a yachid was seeking to do so. Mistam not such a stark hamish mishpacha. And Mistama Ulf Nikzinim gehalten the Balabatischkeit that they can say yes or say no. And ultimately, that question should go to the Rav, and the Rav should decide whether it's something they allow or they don't allow. As we know, when there is a Beis HaKvaros that's run by a community or a chevra, usually they're very particular about the rules and being very strict and keeping to the rules, and there's little tolerance for breaking the rules. So this would have been a big question that would have to deal with. Can we allow this or not? Now, this topic ties into a topic that I mentioned briefly recently. I think it was one of the days we did in halachic history. And I mentioned, it was towards the end, and I think it was pretty quickly, Bekitzer, that I came across a shaila taka about pictures on the wall in a shul, drawings, art of, but very vivid art of people on the wall, and tzuras ish, and how there was a huge shift within Judaism, particularly within Eastern European Hamish Judaism in the last 100 years, from images of people being pretty much non-existent, not tolerated, with some exceptions perhaps here and there, but often clearly there was no musik of depicting people, and then photography slowly just completely eating away, undermining that, and photography being much more of a thing today, and there being almost no resistance left. But back then, there were many people that refused to be photographed, and if they could avoid it, or bichlal. So this also is a helpful data point to see, because how is he going to decide whether it's okay or not? The question isn't so much about the matzeva per se. The question is bichlal about tzuras ish. So he writes, Ksiv b'Torah, L'sasin iti lehi chasav lehi zahav, yinalti mitzayer tzuras adam, ba'aflash hoisei asur. There are sources that imply that it's only a tzura shlema, not just the face, but kvar pasek asmag, huva betaz, we ask even a parts of Adam, even just the face, and that's who the Taz and the Shach follow. So that's the normative mainstream psak, is that even the parts of Adam is also. Ivra, however, that's only the Isser when it's a tzura beletes, but not a tzura shekas, which our tmunas, our tziyurim, are tzura shekas, a tziyur shava. It's not engraved in a manner where it approaches sort of almost the gather of a statue, meaning the level below a statue is engraving a face where the face is sticking out. So that's statuesque. So l'chayra b'tzura shekas, a tziyur shava, tmuna shalonu should be fine, or at least roif hapoiskim matirim, and it's counted among those that you're allowed to keep. But Agoyas Ashri said about the Taz said that it's still usher to have in a shul, because it looks like you're bowing to them. And the Chasam say for Paskin that a Beis HaKvaris, where they are Mishnateach and the Kvarim and daven there, so the Beis HaKvaris is a din of a shul, which definitely sounds like a big leap in its own right, and sounds like it really deserves its own discussion as to the history and the attitudes towards Bate Kvaris. Like I said, these topic of Matzevis, topic of Bate Kvaris, fascinating topics, definitely shinuyim over time. But the Chasam Sefer lay down this yahrzeit that a Beis HaKvaris is then Beis HaKnesses. So very, very good, very geschmack, or convenient, you could say, that in a shul it's aser, so in a Beis HaKvaris it's also aser to even be mitzayer tzura sheikas, even flat pictures should also be aser. Nocha yahrzeit, he says, I found in my Ram Shik that Beis HaKvaris also has a din of a chatzara shutfen, a joint chotzer, and you're not allowed to put something there if your chaver the shutaf is makbid. Everyone can be ma'akev and say, I don't want this in my chotzer. So Bazoi Beis HaKvaris direinu hanekbarim boy kama tamid chacham muflogim v'yireim aleim hashalom bevadalei nuchal hu. They would certainly not like that. They're makbid to put a picture in their chotzer. So bevadi da asal pidin lahamin atmuna neged ritzainu. And he's mitzayin to a few more minor mekaymis, a few more points to bolster his case. He's also mitzayin to Yaakov Emden, Shuvas Yavitz, Chelik Aleph, Sim Kovayim, that there it's mavur that there's hakbada even b'shekas, and from Dorten kommt ois that b'tzeva there's hakbada it's kein tmuna, and chlal the ardeis like the bach v'siyatoi that are oisrim af b'shekas and a few rakba parts of. So b'chlal is a mahalach that any such picture would taka be aser, which ties into that point about treating all pictures as aser. So b'vada in l'cha b'zayin gadol lahem to the Chassidim Anshe Maisa buried in the Beis HaKvaris, the Yetzer Mizeh, to put pictures in their vicinity would be a disgrace to them. And also in Sefer Chassidim, it's mashma that there's no difference between tzudas boltus l'shaykus, so we can answer all imagery, all photography. And Sishut Shari Tzedek, that it's also to write Hungarian, right? It's also to write Goyish letters on the matzeva, whether it's Hungarian or German, on the Lashon HaKodesh, so Alkeina, Dover, Borer, She'os, Lahamed, Fotografia, Amatzevas, Kever, Beveis HaKvaris, Depoi, Umechayovim, Limchus, Biyad HaChafetz, Lamid, Hashem, B'moicha, B'Hashem, Yigdar, Pratzes, Ami, Yisod, Barachmim. So he was standing, Oimid B'Peretz, to prevent this pirza of photography. Like I said, you have the Soviet Yidden. Otherwise, the Taka never really caught on among most Yidden, even not so from or not from Yidden. It's not didn't become a standard thing. It would be interesting to trace the history of where you do see it. I think maybe now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like I have seen in Bati Kvaris, maybe here in America, from Taka 100 years ago, 120 years ago, here and there. It seems like it was like a brief trend that popped up briefly, and a few people jumped on it, but then Taka didn't take off as a huge trend, and you only find it on a few random matzevis. I think I've even seen Taka matzevis in Fruma Batikvaris. Maybe Taka in Montefiore was walking around once near, or not so near, the Rebbe's oil, and I think I maybe saw matzeva Taka that you could see it had an image on it, and you could see the image had been scraped off. So if you Taka hold by this kanos, so even lachar ma'aseh, you want to remove this disgrace. So clearly, that kanos pretty much has become the default, even though when it comes to pictures and other contexts, pretty much hutra ritzua, but in shows and in Batei Kvaris, within the from a Hamish Elam for sure, but even Bechlal, it seems like that line has been held. People aren't pushing that. That isn't where our battles are being fought. People aren't dying to cross that line. So that's where that stands. There are a few more tshuvas there, but don't have time to even do a summary of all of them. But one or two of them are also fairly interesting. But Siman Zayin, which is not a proper tshuva, but a response to a kovitz called kovitz habe'er, and the shaila was about elevators. I don't know if the term elevator would have been used at the time, or a dumbwaiter, or whatever the terms, whatever the technology was at the time, but they had the shaila about using this on Shabbos. This was printed a few years later. This was printed in 1932 in the Habe'er. But he says, Misham Kadmonius, I reached out to Gedolei Hadar. The Eirich says, I reached out to Gedolei Hadar about this. Let me share what I received from Arav, Agoyin HaTzadik HaMefarsim Ba'olam, Moyarash Yolles Atzal, Agoyin based in the Kehillah Stryi v'Hagolil. That's Taka, by the way, his chasima in all of the tshuvas that we have here, Shalom Akoyin Yolles, Arav, this Kehillah Stryi v'Hagolil. Nice to see v'Hagolil in the wild. So this was, as Hashem Yisparach, Gimel Vayeda, Yud Gimel Marcheshvim, Tafresh Pei Dalid, Stryi, so Mamish just a bit over a year before he passed away. Birchas Shalom Ashiv to Reb Tzvi Hirsch, Eirach HaBe'er, Yikras Mechtavai, Dadadad Nachoin Hegiani Hayoim. This is signed though by the son, another son of Reb Shalom HaKohen, B'Shaya Asher, who was also a murder hero in Stryi. So he's the one responding on behalf of his father. V'amar lahashiv, to you, Kabakashase, that Chak Amur Shlita, Ein Daitoi Noicha Lahamzi Hatera Be'inyan Aliyas Ha'avir Luft Aufzug B'Shabbos, Ki Mechzek Ov Dechoil, V'yochel Ligroim Chilol Shabbos B'Shar Dvorim Ha'Elektrium. My father doesn't want to invent a heter for using whatever exactly the technology was at the time, but roughly an elevator, because it looks like Ov Dechoil, and it can be Goyim Chilol Shabbos and the other electrical matters. And Ubeguf Adin, and Yesh Letzadad B'Zeh, Si Shut Marasham, where he's Mavar Kol Atzadim Labir Halacha. So that was a psak Kras Soif Yomov of Reb Shalom HaKohen Yolles, written by his son B'Shmoi, that's printed here in Sifsei Shalom Siman Zayin. And with that, the Sifsei Shalom concludes. That's all we have from Shalom HaKohen Yolles. What it tells us again about his exact Maimed Madrega in halacha personally and in his influence around him, it's hard to say. Hard to say how many tshuvas would help to know how many tshuvas he actually had written and why dafka these were preserved. Was he writing, just a few? Was he writing dozens? Was he writing hundreds? Was he writing thousands? Not fully clear. But like I said, a little bit hard to gauge what the exact darga is, but it tells us something. In conclusion, I want to share some thoughts, thinking out loud, one could say, to share some thoughts about what I think this tells us and how this informs, or could it inform our understanding of the Rebbe's connection with Rav Yolles of Philadelphia himself. Like I said before, Rav Yolles himself immigrated to America a few years earlier. I actually searched through the English newspapers of 1925, and I found a few items about his Yolles in Philadelphia, a picture of him, and my sense is that when he came here, the fact that he came here and where he went, and it seems like perhaps he was looking to be a little bit more with it and up to date. He had a full beard, and the way he describes it later was that he mamish got the Shuls in Philadelphia all together to have a shir gemara, and could very well be true. But I still feel like perhaps B'tzirusai, he was looking to be a different style Rav perhaps than back in Poland. And then over time, he maybe reverted to a more standard Banshak, Choshev Rav of Sheshalos of Rabbanim in Poland. That's just my thought, my sense. Don't know for sure. Perhaps there are those who know more, who know better. But at any rate, it's clear that he enjoyed a very, very unique connection with the Rebbe, a connection that I feel has not fully been understood and appreciated within the Chabad context. It's, I think, seen as something of an outlier, something that's a bit inexplicable. And I would like to argue that perhaps it's more explicable than we are giving it credit for. So clearly, the context is, he comes from this background. There's clearly no Chabad connection, no Chabad context there. Deep tiff in Poland, far away from any connection to Chabad. Yet in America, obviously, would be much more natural to run into Chabad pretty quickly. And it seems like he had a connection with the Frierdiker Rebbe, and then he had a very strong connection with the Rebbe. And the connection was that he would come to the Rebbe fairly often, whatever the Zmanim were. I think there was Zmanim HaKavum that he came, and the Rebbe would walk towards him and treat him, I don't know if you could say like a peer, but gave him tremendous attention, tremendous kavod, would stand and talk to him, would bring him into his room and talk to him, there were times where the Rebbe said Mamorim privately for him, which is mamish an exceptional thing. There's no parallel to that, l'chayra. But the Rebbe mamish treated him like in a class of his own, a special zach. And my impression is that the Arumig Chassidim, the Chabad Chassidim, didn't really have they didn't have the capacity, the framework to digest this, to process this. It just seemed like something they couldn't relate to. The Oilim in 770, whoever they were, didn't seem to necessarily appreciate him too much. I never heard anything hugely, majorly negative, but it doesn't sound like there was a full and proper appreciation. I myself didn't get to be there and see the interactions and develop my own opinion about him as a person and about his interaction with the Rebbe, so I can only speak mehashara. And there have been articles that have been written, but I don't know if those articles really attempt to get to the heart of the matter, or they just describe, this is a Dmus and Lubavitch, so we have to write about him, and they'll write Bekitzer about his yichus a little bit as well, check off the boxes, but I don't think there's an appreciation for this. But I would like to suggest that this is an example of where zooming out and having larger familiarity with the larger Chassidish Welt could be helpful here. Because I think if you look at other Chassidish kreisen, I think this maimid of a Rav who's a Chassidish Rav, who's a B'nan Shel Kedoshim, who, I don't know if the Rav Yolles himself ever officially called himself also a Hemshech of Sambor and took Kvitlach, but his father, like as we discussed and described, certainly did to some extent. Coming from that background, Bechlal Poland in particular has a wealth of Sheshalos of Rabbanim that you don't find in other Eastern European kreisen. You don't find that in Chabad and Lita. You don't have Rabbanim that are just a Sheshalos going back 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, L'mayla b'kodesh of Rabbanim with real yichus, someone who writes an invitation and writes their yichus on their invitation or on their stationery. You see it a tremendous amount by Polish Rabbanim, and it sort of predates and surpasses Chassidus to some extent in some cases. Some yichus, and we know that in Tzans they were proud of the yichus to the Chacham Tzvi, and they write it all over on the Matzevis, etc. So there was this Ashkenazi, Polish yichus that even predates Chassidus and then overlaps and is intertwined with Chassidus. You have a whole class of Banan Shel Kedoshim, but not just a Banshak that's ananical, but Rabbanim have a chshivas. They consider Chashav Rabbanim in their own right, but big part of the chshivas also is derived from the fact that they're coming from this dynasty of Rabbanim. It's a real zach, and you go to Borough Park, you go to Williamsburg, you go to these places, and you have Shauls, Rabbanim. It's not Stam Arav, not Stam Arav Murder Hira. You go to Lakewood, you have a Shaul Rav, you have a more Chashav Murder Hira, but it's all Eigen Yichas, and it's not building on any larger history. These Rabbanim, they embody a whole history. When they walk into a room, they're carrying with them, and not just in the abstract, but it's sort of felt viscerally. They are carrying a history here that they represent, a hemshech to Chashav Rabbanim, tzadikim, Lamayla B'Kodesh, and it informs their identity and how they carry themselves and what they're being mashpia on their surroundings. I don't want to over-romanticize it, but it is a zach, and I think the more English-speaking kreisen, like I like to call it, Chabad and Lakewood and other places, not having dmuyot, not having people with this character around, it's a certain chasar, it's a certain loss. You're lacking a certain thing, and they carry themselves differently. It's a ganze andere Hanhage. Now, there could be those that have that title and aren't deserving of it, and maybe they're litzon, and there are all kinds of caveats and footnotes you could put on it. But overall, there's a whole class of such people, and they exist particularly in the Polish Welt, and perhaps, I guess, the Hungarian Welt as well, which is an ispashtusa to some extent of the Polish Welt. And you have dynasties of Poland that ended up in Hungary as well, and the discussion of Hungary and its dynamics is its own discussion. In these kreisen, let's say in Bayan, there's not enough evidence to see what exactly his maimed in Bayan Chernovitz was, but in these kreisen, such a Rav with a Zayichos, and as we saw, that you had Rebbes that continued traveling to greater Rebbes above them, and clearly when they came, they had a special maimed, and so these are behemshich to those. Someone like that, when they came to a Rebbe, they got a bazundra special treatment. There wasn't the regular yachas that a regular chassid gets. They are in a class of their own, and often the analogy is made to aristocracy, nobility, royals, and there is much to that analogy, and it is helpful here as well, in that they have minor nobility status as opposed to being a commoner, and it could be the local mayor, and the mayor could have power, but if the mayor is a commoner, then Eine Doime to someone else who maybe doesn't have an official shtela, but has very chashuv yichus and carries it, and carries it with them in a very visceral way, like I said. And these B'nan Shel Kedoshim, these, especially if they're Rabbanim, they have a special maimed. They had a special maimed 100 years ago or more in these Haifen, and I think Adu Yom Hazeh to some extent, with whatever the dynamics in the Chassidish world are today. There are Rabbanim that have these, that have the status. There even are mashpachas of Rabbanim that are known in the Rebbe Welt as mashpachas that the Rebbes can do shidduchim with, because the Rebbes can only do shidduchim with people of their stature, of their status, but they can't always find the Rebbe shidduch. So they also have mashpachas of certain Rabbanim that they could do shidduchim with them. This is a Rabbanish mashpacha that does Rebbe shidduchim. It's almost like Chabad, like I said, doesn't really have this. Chabad doesn't have shesholis of Rabbanim. The history of Rabbanim in Chabad is its own interesting topic, and what the status and the class of the Rabbanim was, even B'doid of the Alter Rebbe, was probably its own thing and a bit different than the status of Rabbanim Bisman of the Marash. I'm not here to, this is not the opportunity to do that survey, do that overview, but even clearly it's hard to find. There were certain Rabbanim, Reb Hillel Parish, wasn't really his yichus, but he was kamat atzadik b'schus atzmoi, if he would have lived in Poland, he pretty much would have been considered a tzaddik who's a talmud of another tzaddik. But in Russia, they don't have quite that framework, so he was just barely beneath a tzaddik. And Taka, from the descriptions, it sounds like when he was come to the tzemach tzaddik, it was a special yachas, or even Rebbe Isaac of Vitebsk, Rebbe Isaac of Hummel. Isaac of Hummel Dafka did have Yichus Epstein, which is its own topic. I don't know if that informed how people regarded him, whether he carried that Epstein Yichus with him or not. I don't know, that's a little hard for me to say. But there were Rabbanim that had a certain chshivas. There were also Chassidim from the previous Deiros, and they got grandfathered in. So that could also be part of it. And the Rebbe, we know, had, at least maybe there were ups and downs, but the Rebbe had a certain yachas with the B'Shol Jacobson, the Shmuel Levittin, at least initially. They also had like a special stature, a special status above that of regular Chassidim, and they have a special sprach with the Rebbe. So there is Bis'er Ampen, there is something like that, there is that musig, but not quite the way it exists in the Polish belt. Rav Yolles of Philadelphia was one such person. I never met him, but again, I believe that he carried himself that way. I think that someone like the Rebbe, who, first of all, Bechlal, is Rebbe, coming from a Rebbe Mishpacha, and part of that world of nobility and aristocracy. And also the Rebbe, I think, just having broader horizons, Breiter Sagas, being a bit more familiar, having been around, having traveled around, been in Poland, been in places, seen tzadikim, seen how they fear sich in Poland by tzadikim. The Rebbe would have been familiar, very familiar with this derech, this anhaga, this firicht. So for the Rebbe to treat Rav Yolles as he treated him, I think actually is perfectly normal, makes perfect sense in any other context. It's just a chiddush within the Chabad context. Within the Chabad context, the average foot soldiers, the average chassidim maybe didn't have this musig and didn't relate to it. But this definitely, I think, contributed to his maimed by the Rebbe. Now, of course, I think it's probably 50% his personality, and clearly he had a sprach with the Rebbe, and I believe it's important to identify the people whom the Rebbe had a sprach with, and it's a certain list of people, of interesting people with interesting kashrenas, and there also are chveis, random chassidim or random mukaravim that the Rebbe also had an interesting connection with. But let's focus on Rabbanim Machabri Svarim. There's a certain list of Rabbanim Machabri Svarim that the Rebbe clearly had a sprach with. Some are more well known, some are less, but this is certainly someone who belongs on that list as well. Clearly had a sprach with the Rebbe. And you see it's not just in the personal meetings, but also in the Igris, as we saw, for the Rebbe to express himself in the Igris in that way, in both letters. Clearly, these are just two out of many, but those are the two that we focused on here. For the Rebbe to express himself that way, it shows both a sprach, a special connection on a personal level, but I think it's also 50% the status that he had. I think if more people of his stature had come around, even Rav Hirschsprung didn't have that stature of that whole background, but even someone like him who came around, had somewhat more of a special yachas than your average community rabbi, or even if he's a Talmid Chacham. You can rank them. You can rank them according to how much they embody some of that spirit. But if someone of Rav Yolles' yichus and background and stature, if more of those had come around, they also had a shvach with Rebbe, I think the Rebbe would also have treated them similarly, perhaps. And we do see a me'ain of this, and that in the later years when different Rebbes would come, and even after the Rebbe stopped with the Yechidus, so when different Rosh Yeshivas came, garnished, they had a Yechidus with the Rebbe, and it's the Rebbe obviously treats each person individually on their level, as we saw earlier, the union of Dovid, being able to relate to everybody. But the idea of, just like today, you look at the Rebbe's Olam, and you see how the Rebbes, they have bikurim, they visit each other, and there's a whole system to it. There's a certain etiquette to how it's done and how they converse and the type of conversation they have. Is again, the terms like nobility, aristocracy, and royal etiquette definitely come to mind. And we see that the Rebbe did have this dynamic with Rebbes, dafka, those that came from Rebbe's background, even sons, Eniklach, that hadn't fully accepted the Rebbistva. The Rebbe, in his interaction with them, I believed very clearly that the Rebbe did count this yichus for something. It's not in Chabad. It's often just completely laughed at and mocked and seen as zero and being less than zero. I think to the Rebbe, it's very clearly, if you had that yichus and you carried it with even a smidgen of seriousness, that you embodied it to some extent, I think the Rebbe took it very, very seriously, very earnest. And a raya to this we can bring, maybe perhaps from his letter, if my interpretation of the letter is correct, that the Rebbe does see these manhigim as being tzadikim and manhigim in the gather of manhigim and tzadikim to whatever extent. They're just not our manhigim and not our tzadikim, but there's something there. It's not in ganzen garnished the way it's common to see it. So the Rebbe, let's say in his case, I mean, I'm sort of jumping around a bit here, but let's say in his case, the Rebbe would have appreciated the yichus of Sambor, everything that we were masber, the yichus of Sambor and the connection to bells and the connection to Sadiger and Bayan, that would have meant something to the Rebbe, that would have counted for something. And coming from that means that you're in a different league, you're not a regular person. What exactly that means? Does that mean that we should treat you like a tzaddik? I don't know what exactly it means. Obviously, that's where some of the regular standard Chabad hashkafa of not taking it too seriously can come into the picture. But to look at it as zero, as counting for nothing, as absolutely nothing, that's clearly not the Rebbe's perspective. But in order to have that perspective, you need to first, like I said, zoom out a bit, be familiar with the bigger picture, have an appreciation for some of this history, for some of these dynamics, for these Rebbeim and these Talmidim and these fathers and these sons. And then back to the point I was saying, which is that when other such Banan Shel Kodeshim came to the Rebbe would treat them with that etiquette reserved for Azacha Chashuva people. And the Rebbe would sit and talk with them, and it wasn't just the ones with a lot of power. Sometimes it was those that didn't seem to have that much power, or the Rebbe was encouraging them to assume the Rebbe fan, to be Mamshech the Rebbe fan, to print the Kisvei Chassidus, very clearly a very special yachas to anything to do with that. Ultimately, just if you take it kipshutoy, they are in some sense mamshichim of the Baal Shem Tov, of the Rav HaMagid, and you can't sneeze at that. There is a hemshech. Your average Lubavitch chassid, with all his milas, is not a mamshich of the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid in the way that these people are to some extent. And I think the Rebbe counted that for something. It's an emes zach, it's a real zach. Whether or not they're fully worthy, and just like in Chabad, we have a system of shluchim. If the Rebbe was Mamani, you also shliach. So then bizgar gar hoich. So we create our own equivalent system, and then you can come from shluchim royalty. So we basically figured out a way to create our equivalent system. And Litvish Welt now has its dynasties of Rosh Yeshivas, but it's all from the last 100 years or so. So Litvish Welt has also sort of created its version of that. But the Chassidish world has a version of that dates back to the Magid. It's an ernst Zach. I think the Rebbe saw it as an ernst Zach and took it seriously and felt that if they print their Chassidus, it's a form of printing a portion of Teres Baal Shem Tov, Teres HaMagid. Nishtam, it's not someone that comes and says they're Eigen Teres, no matter how smart and clever they are. It's kommt nicht zu to something like that. I feel like this has to be articulated and emphasized because I haven't heard it quite articulated and emphasized enough. And I think there are the more within Chabad, there's a small percentage of people that happen to be familiar with the larger Chassidish Welt for whatever reason, whether they also have something of a different background or they just happen to live around Charedim, live in a Charedi area, and they are curious, or whatever the hezbollah is. I think those that are more familiar with that are more likely to understand either implicitly or explicitly that the Rebbe was also clearly picking up on these dynamics, and they did count for something, they did mean something to the Rebbe, and they were real in some sense, and it wasn't just a joke. And so this reflects itself. You look at all the conversations that Rebbe had with Rebbes, Rebbelach, whatever you want to call it, over the years, sons of Rebbes that, like I said, hadn't decided whether they're going to continue or not. You could see the Rebbe's yachas was clearly different and unique and special, and the Rebbe took it seriously. And the Rebbe encouraged as many as possible to be mamshich and to create a hemshich. Clearly, that hemshich is important, and that it's a piece of hemshich of the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid, azoi verstehe ich. And that would certainly apply in this case. as well. So those Rebbes were only coming, they came once, twice, 3 times, whatever it is. They weren't coming they were coming to sit with the Rebbe, to have that sort of chashuva formal meeting with the Rebbe, and the Rebbe Taka kept his part of it and respected it. And Rav Yolles is the only one who went much further, and Pashat came out that maimed of someone coming from Shpachos of Rabbanim and tzadikim and coming out to Chash V'Rov to be bottled to the Rebbe, and I think the Rebbe was reciprocating to that and treating him as one would treat someone, if you were familiar with how one treats such a person, if you wish to honor them and acknowledge them and respect them for what they are, for who they are. I think the Rebbe's engagement with him and treatment of him is very logical and makes a lot of sense in that context. And that's what led to the Rebbe in the letter, to conclude with what we began with, the letter of the Rebbe acknowledging the yahrzeit of Yud Menachem Av, Taka this date, and what the Rebbe said, which again seems to be acknowledging the p'stachshivos of his father and these tzadikim. I think that all makes more sense and is makes it is fitting. It fits in with this within this context as I've explained it. Perhaps there's what to add, what to be mairich, but we've already been mairich plenty, so we will leave it at that. If anyone has any further comments, questions, aris, always happy to hear as usual.